Okay, so we're going to get started again. Sorry about the quick shuffle, but it was important that we set this up as a discussion, which is exactly what it is. Who in the room knows what LavaBit is? Okay, that was very encouraging. So, sorry?
How many of you knew about LavaBit 3 months ago?
How many of you knew what LavaBit was 3 months ago? There you go. That was the first question from Ladar. So, Chris Grundeman, who's on the NANOG program committee, is going to have an informal discussion. We encourage questions from the audience. We'll ask you just to conform to the normal guidelines that we have, but please, feel free to speak and ask whatever you'd like. And with that, Chris, thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I guess I wanted to start off first and just kind of give some context. I think there was a lot of hands went up for folks who understand what's going on. I don't know how in-depth everybody's read everything though, so I wanted to start with, you tell us a little bit about yourself and who is Ladar and start there.
Yeah, my name's Ladar and I'm a nerd. I guess I'm in good company. No, I've been working with computers for as long as I can remember, and I went to school and I tried to become one of those finance geeks, and it just didn't work out. So I went back to technology and spent a lot of time as a consultant working, IT services for financial companies, things of that nature, but also in my free time building this little email service that I originally built as a email service by geeks for geeks. I don't know how many of you know this, but we actually started out with the name Nerd Shack. Apparently it was a little too nerdy for some of our users, so we changed it after a couple of years into what became LavaBit. Okay. And that's really my background.
So I think that's a great segue. What is the history behind LavaBit? What was LavaBit? What is LavaBit? And what prompted you to start Nerd Shack and eventually LavaBit? Yeah,
well, I was sitting on this great domain name, nerdshack.com, and I just didn't know what to do with it. So come April 1st, 2004, everybody remembers that day, right? That was the first day of Gmail. And I was sitting around with my friends and we were like, well, we could grab some open source software and some cheap hard drives from the local computer store and we can offer free email services with large quotas too. Little did I know how hard that would be. But that's kind of how it started, just as a project. And it grew from there. I quickly realized that email is one of those problems that's really easy to solve as long as you can fit everybody onto a single server, and becomes very difficult to solve when you try and distribute it out over multiple servers, at least doing it cheaply. So I effectively decided to solve the problem doing the one thing that I knew how to do well, and that was write code. And I basically built this clustered distributed system for handling email. Probably looks a lot like Gmail, at least from an architectural standpoint. And it grew from there. And a lot of people ask, well, how did you become so interested in protecting privacy? Well, when I was building that platform back in 2004, a lot of you remember that was kind of the height of the NSL scare, when ISPs were receiving these national security letters and not being able to tell us about them, not being able to tell us what information was being demanded. And sort of my natural reaction was, well, I don't want to be put in that position, so I'll just develop this system so I don't have any information that's, or at least usable information to turn over. So I figured I didn't need to log the meta information, I just wouldn't. I figured, well, the one piece of information that I would need to store on the server that would be private, that I could be forced to turn over, would be emails. So I'd just use my knowledge of cryptography to basically encrypt everyone's emails before they're written to disks, so that from that point forward they could only be read with a person's password. And the service grew. When I shut down, it had over 410,000 registered users. We were seeing between 40 and 50,000 logins a day, about 1.4 million emails a week. Certainly not up there in the grand scheme of things, but I think we had definitely established ourselves as one of the few medium-sized email service providers out there.
Sure. And then you said up until you shut down, right? So before you shut down, you had 410,000 users, and then you shut down. So it sounds like you were fairly successful, right? Things were moving along. You're getting good traffic, getting good logins. I mean, users. They're also a paid service for users.
Yeah. I had about 10,000 paid users. I've been working on it mostly full time for the last couple of years. Before that, I had to obviously do a lot of consulting work, and I only got to spend part of my time working on the service. But
Sure.
it was a business that I built up over time. I decided very early on that I didn't want to take in venture capital because I wanted to keep it true to its sort of philosophical underpinnings.
Okay.
That's where the service was. I think if I had taken it a different approach, for example, if I had had investors or partners or, for example, a huge payroll, I wouldn't have been able to make the decision that I did.
Yeah.
At the time, I only had one other full-time employee, and he was in line with me philosophically, and we both kind of felt that, given what the government was asking for, the only ethical thing to do would be to shut down the service.
And so that begs the question then, why did you shut it down? Obviously, the government was asking for things. What was the government asking for, and why did you ultimately decide to shut down LavaBit as a response?
Well, for most of you, or for if any of you that don't know, what my fight's about is whether or not the government can come and demand my SSL private key. If there are any certificate authorities out there, you should really look into my case. Because if I can't protect my keys, you can't protect your keys either. But effectively what the government said is that we have this law in the books called the Pen, Trap, and Trace law that allows us to monitor a service provider and collect meta information. Who a person is emailing, when they're logging in, and from where. The problem was, at least with my service, is all that information was protected via SSL. Now, in most cases, that's not an issue, because as all of you know, in most cases, email servers write that data out to log files and have it ready and available to hand over. I didn't. So what the government decided to do was demand my SSL keys, crack open that encryption, and collect the information themselves. This was instead of letting me modify the software to collect that information for that one user, which they wouldn't accept. They also wouldn't provide any transparency back to me to ensure that this device that they were putting on my network to collect this information wouldn't be collecting other information such as content and passwords. It's one of those things, as we all know, you don't just put third-party devices on your network. It's kind of a scary proposition from a security standpoint. It's even more scary when you take into account that that device has your encryption keys and can inspect everything coming in and out of your network. The reason SSL exists is to prevent sensitive information being picked up by eavesdroppers. So, I was kind of left in a pickle, so to speak. I couldn't log into my own network securely, my own, web-based administrative tools. And, like I said, the FBI investigators wouldn't provide me with any kind of assurances that they were only going to be collecting meta information. In fact, to the contrary, when they first approached me, they actually told me that they would be collecting passwords and content, even though they weren't legally authorized to do that. That scared me just a little bit.
Sure. So I want to roll it back for a second, just because I think that there's several small operators here at NANOG and then obviously larger operators and stuff. I want to kind of walk through how this all unfolded and what all happened. So I think it started in about May, or at least as far as we know.
Yeah. I've gotten requests over the years, search warrants and subpoenas for user information. Never really had a problem with it because they've always been narrowly tailored to demand the information belonging to that specific user. I would run a search on my server, grab whatever email messages belonging to that user existed on the server at that time, turn around and send them off. I had a little bit of meta information in my database, not much, but I'd dump that out and turn that over. And that would be the end of it. So I was a little surprised when come May, I get home and there's a little business card on my door from an FBI agent, and on the back says, "We should meet." We ended up linking up via email, setting up an appointment, and he came by with his partner, and we spent several hours talking. And he didn't know at that time why he was talking to me. He presumed that there was an investigation underway involving one of my users, but he didn't know who it was. It may not have been related to the investigation that ultimately demanded my SSL keys. There's no way of knowing that, but I spent several hours talking to him, explaining to him that if it was a secure account, I wouldn't have any emails. This is how my network is designed. I don't have meta information. I don't make it a habit of collecting it, etc. I also divulged my deepest and darkest secrets so that he could conduct a background check on me. Apparently, the FBI likes working with people that have security clearances. And that was the last I heard from that particular agent until June 28th, when he showed up at my door unannounced and said, "Oh, by the way, I have a warrant for you. It hasn't arrived yet, but I was sent over here just to serve you anyways and let you know that it was coming." And then, of course, his BlackBerry rings and the warrant arrives and he forwards it to me. So we're sitting there talking for another 2 or 3 hours, and I haven't seen the warrant that's been presented to me. But he claims that not only does it provide them with the authority to collect meta information, but the authority to collect passwords, content, and requires me to turn over my SSL keys. And of course, my answer was, I think I need to consult an attorney, because I've never heard of the FBI coming along and demanding the private keys of a business before. I don't think I need to explain to this particular audience just how important those SSL keys are when it comes to security and identity verification. And it kind of left it at that. Like I said, we ended up talking for 2 or 3 hours.
And then did he, at that time, so that was June 28th?
June 28th, he left. I didn't get a chance to read the warrant at that point because he had come over at like 5 or 6 o'clock, and it was like 8 or 9 o'clock before he left. But Monday, I checked my email, and there waiting for me in my inbox is the original pen, trap, and trace order, but also an order to compel. Apparently, as soon as he left my office, he called up his friends in Washington, and they immediately filed for an order to compel that same day, which I thought was a little bit strange. I didn't think our government moved that fast. But again, that order to compel, and at that point, I read everything much more carefully. I actually, at that time, thought it did include content because it said signaling information. And I'm thinking signal to noise ratio, well, that's just their way of referring to the information coming across the wire. Well, in reality, that meant the DTMF tones that go along with a telephone call. And I wouldn't find that out until I actually got a lawyer involved in my case, which would be another 2 weeks. But I thought they did have the authority to collect content, and I didn't think they had the authority to demand my SSL keys, because all the order said was technical assistance. To me, technical assistance is assistance installing their pen, trap, and trace device. Showing them which cables, mirroring off our uplink port if that's what they required, something of that nature. But providing the SSL keys would be going a little bit above and beyond.
Sure.
And so I asked them via email to put their request for technical assistance in writing, particularly since they misquoted me in the order to compel by saying I had the power to decrypt my user's information. I had the power, but only if I knew their password. Right. I never got that email demanding the SSL keys. It was like they were afraid to put the request in writing. But about 2 weeks later, I contacted the EFF, by the way, and they put me in touch with a lawyer who I managed to finally link up with. I spoke to her Monday night. Tuesday morning, I spoke to her again. hung up the phone to email her all of the documents that I had seen at that point, and my doorbell rang. My friendly neighborhood FBI agents were back. And this time, they were delivering a summons for me to appear 1 week from that day at a courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia.
And you live where?
Dallas. That was a problem, considering the lawyer I had just found was in San Francisco and couldn't even represent me in Alexandria. So the plot thickened. I still didn't have anything in writing demanding my SSL keys. What I had was an order to show cause, to show up in front of the judge and explain to him why I was refusing the pen, trap, and trace device order, which in fact I wasn't refusing. I told the agents that previous Friday when I met with them that if they set up an appointment, I'll meet them down at the data center and we'll get that device installed. The only issue I have is turning over those SSL keys. Apparently that wasn't communicated, at least to the judge, until I showed up and told him. Well, it got a little more interesting. Obviously the lawyer who I had been working with couldn't help me because just of the logistical issues. She communicated that back to the Department of Justice, and they decided to hit me with an extra, a subpoena at that point. And that was the first piece of paper I had demanding the SSL keys. Also demanding that I appear before a grand jury and present those keys the following Tuesday at that same day that summons was.
Okay. Now, let me stop you for a second there, because you've gotten these requests from the FBI, and there was an original warrant, and then there was you have additional information actually asking for the SSL keys. But during this whole case, you're also compelled not to tell anyone about it, right?
Yeah, that was one of the more disturbing aspects of this. You know, it hit me. Our government's gotten smart. If they're going to break the rules and violate the Constitution, they've realized that all they have to do is make it illegal for anybody who knows about it to tell anybody. That way, if anybody says, hey, you're violating the Constitution, you're breaking the law, they go to jail.
Sure. Which you did, right? Somewhere at this point, you told them that you were not going to be complicit, right? That handing over those keys would give them access to all of your users.
Well, I did everything I could to oppose the request within the boundaries of the law. I showed up in Alexandria and I explained to the judge that I was in fact willing to let them install that trap and trace device. And that's when the prosecutor for the Department of Justice stood up and said, well, that's not the issue here. The issue is the SSL keys. And there's a great quote in the transcripts where the judge basically says, well, that original order didn't give you the authorization to demand those keys. It was only for the trap and trace device, and it seems like he's willing to let you install it. Duh. So why did I just fly 1,000 miles? But I also requested that the case be unsealed on the grounds that I thought the rest of you needed to know what was going on. Namely, that the feds were coming along and demanding these SSL keys from private businesses and all the implications that go along with that. And the prosecutor made that very same case to the judge, and the judge still said no. But he did grant a continuance, and that gave me time to retain an attorney. And given that I'm the patriot that I am, I thought all I had to do was hire a lawyer who could explain to the judge just how important these keys were and why there was no law on the books that allowed them to collect them, and the issue would go away.
Did it?
I was wrong. Come, I believe it was around August 4th, the judge ruled on the motion to quash, denied it, and demanded that I turn over the keys by 10 a.m. the following morning. Well, lucky for me, I had printed out the keys and put them in an envelope when I went to DC for that grand jury subpoena appearance. By the way, they had released me from that appearance, so that's why I didn't get to turn over the keys then. But I still had that envelope.
What would have happened if you hadn't? So they said you had to turn over the keys by 10 a.m. the next day.
Yeah.
There's probably an or what when you're dealing with the government, right?
Or it'll be $1,000 a day. So I thought, well, I already have this envelope with these keys printed out. Might as well just turn that over. After all, that is surrendering the information to the federal government.
Sure.
Didn't say in the order what format it had to be in.
So specifically in the envelope, there's pages with printed out 2056, 2048 byte keys.
Yeah, and because I was using the PEM format, my files had the certificate and the entire certificate chain in the same file.
Okay.
And it was 5 keys. So you had 5 certificates, 5 certificate chains, and 5 private keys. In total, it was about 11 pages.
11 pages sounds a little short.
11 pages. I believe it was 8-point font. And I noticed that, you know, what is it, only about 120 characters or 80 characters that the PEM format loops around, so I decided that I could do 2 columns.
Okay.
I was nice, though. I included line numbers, just in case they got lost.
There you go. Keep track of where you're at when you're typing it back in.
Yeah.
And so what was the response then? So you provided this, and did that satisfy the need?
Well, they came back the following Monday and said, we're hitting you with a $5,000 fine starting now, and for every 24 hours that it takes for you to turn over the CD, we're going to hit you with an additional $5,000. And oh, by the way, we can't come pick up the keys tonight.
At least one day.
So I was at least going to be 2 days. So I decided to stretch it out and just give myself as much time as possible, because I had resolved long before that if I was forced to surrender those keys, the only ethical choice would be to shut down the service. The only issue was, do I shut it down for 24 hours in protest or permanently until, you know, the case is resolved in the courts? And when I got hit with a $10,000 fine, I thought, well, that was my margin for error. I better stay shut down until the case resolves itself. And if I win, open the service back up. And if I lose, turn it over to somebody who doesn't mind living abroad.
Yeah. Now, it turns out that actually handing over the keys in the printed out format, not only probably a little jab, but also ended up maybe having a positive influence on the case overall.
Yeah, one thing that my lawyer was nice enough to explain to me after I got the contempt charge was that apparently I couldn't have appealed the demand for the SSL keys unless I had drawn the contempt charge. If I had simply turned over the keys and tried to appeal it, they would have withdrawn the request, and I would have no standing for an appeal. And of course, by the time any of that would have worked its way through the court system, they would have had access to my system for who knows how many days. But the fact that I actually got the contempt charge, see, I didn't just use standard, you know, Courier New. I actually contemplated using one of those fonts that closely resembles Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Right. Was it?
Decided that was a little bit too much of a rebellion and went with one that would just be difficult to OCR, you know, where the L's kind of run into the F's and the lines were nice and extra skinny. I figured I want to make sure that when I'm going through the TSA checkpoint on my way to DC, somebody doesn't disappear with this envelope for 10 minutes and come back and hand it to me, because then think about the position I'm in. I don't know if my keys have been compromised.
Sure.
I don't know if I need to shut down. So I wanted to make sure that if I handed over the keys, they'd have to type in the data by hand. Figured at the very least it would give me time to get back to Dallas and shut down the service. But they decided that it was illegible. They couldn't read it. And it kind of looks that way. That my plan kind of worked.
Yeah. So then you turned over the keys at that point, right after $10,000 of fines, 2 days.
I shut down. I dropped off some external drives and started dumping all the data off to some external drives, because I didn't know if when I shut down they were going to show up and just confiscate everything. And I figured, well, what's the point of trying to protect my users' privacy if they just show up and confiscate all the servers? So Tuesday night, I showed up with some external drives, set them up as encrypted, and started dumping all the data off. And Wednesday morning, I drove over and dropped off the keys. Now, there's an interesting story there.
Okay.
Apparently, the FBI agents found out I had a gun. I live in Texas, after all. Which is why they demanded when I surrendered the keys that I do it at a neutral location. Apparently, they told my lawyer they were afraid I was going to shoot him. I was like, you're messing with me enough that you're afraid I'm going to shoot you, and you're still going forward and demanding this information? But when I showed up to actually surrender the keys, it was kind of funny because I had 3 FBI agents walk out of the Dallas field office, all openly carrying sidearms. It's like that's the first time I'd seen those guys openly carry. I guess they were afraid. I guess they haven't heard of the court system for resolving disputes, but it's always one of my great little anecdotes, you know, welcome to Texas.
Yeah. So speaking of the court system, now, since then, because you gave them the paper, they charged you with contempt based on giving them a printed copy of what they asked for, and now you're appealing that. And obviously, we talked about earlier that during this whole process, because it was an issue of national security, I'm assuming that's why they were able to stop you from talking about it. And now we've talked quite a bit about what's actually gone on here. So what's happened in that case that's allowed us to talk about this, and what's going on with you right now?
Well, in this case, and you know, there are multiple issues at play here, but at least in this case, everything was filed in district court, and it was filed under seal. So I could discuss it with my attorney, but only with my attorney under penalty of law. And if you go back and you read the statute, basically it's written with the idea that you're not allowed to disclose to the person under investigation that they're under investigation. And basically the way the courts have interpreted that is you're not allowed to disclose to anybody except your attorney that you've even received one of these requests, let alone any of the details, you know, surrounding the request, like at least in this case, the demand for the SSL keys.
Sure.
And as a result, for the past 2 months, I've been jumping up on my soapbox saying, you know, I understand the need for keeping the names of the people under investigation a secret. What I think we need to have a discussion about publicly are the methods that our government is using to conduct that surveillance. And that's what I've been working to get unsealed, and lo and behold, after denying requests from me and my legal team to get the documents unsealed, the judge reversed his decision last week, unsealed most of the documents, everything except the name of the person under investigation, and now for the first time I get to tell you that yes, it was a demand for my SSL keys. That's what I'm fighting for.
And I have one more question, and then I think we're going to open it up and ask questions so folks have things they'd like to ask Ladar. Probably now make your way to the mics. And so the thing that strikes me about this the most is that what I understand from reading a lot of articles and from speaking to you earlier is that you basically agreed to comply, right? You said, I will give you the information that the warrant's asking for. I will find a way, right? You could pull the information off specifically that they needed and be able to provide that to them. That wasn't good enough. They wanted the SSL keys.
When I did finally get a lawyer involved, and she explained to me that this pen, trap, and trace order only gives them permission to collect meta information, I was like, well, I'm not prepared to shut down my business just to protect meta information. You know, the reason I didn't record it to a log file was because I didn't want to have to turn it over via an NSL. Well, as we all know, NSLs are now unconstitutional. They actually have this kangaroo court that they go to get them, but that's a different story. So I didn't necessarily have an objection to modifying, or in this case, adding code to the daemon that would log out this meta information for this one specific user so I'd have it to turn over. Right. And they came back to me and said, well, we wouldn't be getting it in real time. You mean you wouldn't be able to log into your device on my network and change the collection parameters in real time? At least that's what I'm thinking.
Sure.
But they insisted on pursuing the SSL keys. And then I went back to him and I said, okay, well, what if we configure this collection device together? I see that it's configured to only collect and provide you with the information that you're legally authorized to obtain, excuse me, on this one particular user. And then I hold 10 characters of the password and you hold 10 characters of the password. Mm-hmm. They didn't like that idea either. They said, give us your keys and trust us. There's a great quote. When I was in DC meeting with the Department of Justice attorneys after the hearing, I was trying to explain the sacred trust between a service and its users. That as the operator, it was my job to protect that trust. And that if I allowed them this sort of unrestricted access to my users' information, that it would be a violation of that sacred trust. And the lead prosecutor's response was, do you really think your users trust you more than they trust us? I said yes.
If not then, now for sure.
No, I said yes then.
Yeah.
I also got into a long explanation of why it was important to unseal the request, because, you know, how do you fight in a democratic society to get a law changed that nobody knows exists?
Sure. And so your appeal against the contempt charge is, can you talk to anybody about the grounds of what the appeal is on? So are you saying that they couldn't ask for it, or?
What we're working on now, and the appeal was actually supposed to be filed last Thursday. Well, they unsealed everything on Wednesday, which kind of changed the logistics of our filing, because what was going to be in the public version versus the sealed version changed. So I think it's going to be filed tomorrow. But what we're appealing are the search warrant and the subpoena that explicitly demanded the SSL keys, on the grounds that if I win that appeal, then the contempt charge goes away, because it was on the basis of me refusing to comply with those orders. So effectively what my team is arguing is that not only does the law not provide the necessary statutory basis for demanding these keys, but that they'd violate the Fourth Amendment, because they would provide access to information that didn't belong to the user. In fact, it would provide access to information that belonged to every user and required turning over information that belonged to the business, who, at least in this case, was an innocent third party. So that's what my legal fight is about. And, you know, it's one of those things where when I shut down the service, I didn't really know what was going to happen. I had a lawyer that was willing to take it all the way, but didn't necessarily have the resources to win it. And I threw up that link asking for donations, and I was just overwhelmed. I think we raised about $150,000 in the first few weeks. And, you know, if it weren't for that money, I don't think we'd have had a chance of actually winning this fight. And it just goes to show you how important the ability to speak out is. Sure. You know, there was no way as a small business I would have been able to raise the resources needed for this fight if it weren't for my ability to tell you guys what was going on. You know, and if there are any certificate authorities in the audience, I know a few of the companies are represented here, you may want to go back to your legal teams and talk to them about filing friend of the court briefs or amici briefs, because this issue is going to affect all of us. You know, it goes beyond SSL keys, because technologies change. It goes to whether or not a company, a service provider, or a technology company can have private information, intellectual property, that it can be forced to turn over to aid in a government investigation of somebody using its product or service. And if the court says that we basically have to do everything in our power to assist in these investigations, then we can have no secrets. We can't keep these private keys secret. We can't keep our source code secret. we can't be, or sorry, we could be forced to modify our products and services secretly to allow for government surveillance. And if you look at the letter I put up on my website where I talk about how this issue plays into trust, can you trust a company with physical ties to the US? That's precisely what I'm talking about. You know, we don't know who's been cooperating with the government to conduct investigations, which products have been changed to weaken their security to allow for surveillance. And those companies couldn't tell us. And what's happening is the rest of the world, not to mention those of us in America who are just a little bit conscious of information security, we don't know who to trust anymore. So we just don't trust anyone. And that's going to have a profound effect on American businesses, on all of you. So leave it at that. Any questions?
There are mics throughout the hall, left and right and center. We'll go with Louis first, since you walked up first, and then you, Dan.
Thank you very much. I don't know, what else to say, for doing this.
I'm blushing. I'm not used to it. I'm used to being a computer geek who spends most of his time in front of his computer.
Now you're in the adoration of geeks. In shutting down a service, that doesn't necessarily mean that the keys are now gone away and the evidence that they were seeking have gone away. Or does it actually mean that? And then perhaps they can charge you with destroying evidence.
It's been falsely reported that I destroyed all the data on the servers, and there was a little bit of confusion there. I did scrub the servers, but I also preserved the data on encrypted drives, because you're precisely right. If I had destroyed all of the data, I would have faced an obstruction of justice charge because I knew that there was an ongoing investigation. And apparently the feds love prosecuting guys like me who give them a hard time, either on obstruction of justice charges or lying to a federal law enforcement officer. Those are apparently the two big things that they like to catch people like me on. And so yeah, no, I couldn't destroy the data. I still have it on encrypted disks and may or may not have been forced to turn some of it over. Oh, one other thing. They did have the tap in place before I shut down. If they had been recording, because I didn't use or didn't have Diffie-Hellman enabled, it's possible that once they got the keys, they could have gone back and retroactively decrypted some of the data that they may have recorded. All I did by shutting down was prevent them from using any of that information, such as the passwords to log into accounts, or collecting any additional information. I guess it's worth noting that technically, at least as far as I know, they didn't have the legal authority to record. Doesn't seem to stop them much, but who knows? If I can give everyone here a message, it would be, I think as a community, we need to make more of an effort to support Diffie-Hellman, because it would at least limit the damage in situations like this. It would limit their ability to decrypt SSL connections as a third-party observer, and it would mean that if you were forced to turn over your keys at some future date, they couldn't retroactively go back and decrypt information. It would effectively force them to do a man in the middle, which at least in my case they would have done, but in a lot of other cases they may not be prepared to do.
Dan Golding with Iron Mountain. I think one of the most interesting things that you said was that they were sure of their own moral rectitude, essentially. And I think that's a very important thing for folks to understand, that many times when you deal, especially with federal law enforcement, the first thing you try to do is explain the situation. And from personal experience, they understand the situation. The days when you were dealing with people who did not understand the technology or the ethical impacts of this are long since over. As you said, they sincerely believe they are acting in the moral best interest of everyone. They sincerely believe that the majority of people, except for a tiny fraction, of which I think we all are, trust them, and they are offended beyond all measure if you say things like, "Why should I trust you?" So I
No,
guess
you're absolutely right. They would get offended. They got offended by me, questioning whether or not I could trust them with this information. And I really think, at least in this case, the Department of Justice lawyers didn't know the ramifications of what they were trying to do. They were just being told by the FBI, "We need this information, would you please go get it from us?" But I definitely think you're right. The FBI agents involved knew exactly how sensitive this information was and precisely what they were demanding.
Right. So I think that underscores the importance for technical folks, of attorneys, of legal counsel. Your first action should always be to call your legal counsel. Our first inclination as engineers is always to explain. We have a duty to our customers to protect their data. It's both a moral duty and a contractual duty. The first thing you should do is call your attorney before you try to explain. Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and if you're a company big enough to have an attorney on retainer, you should definitely call them. As a two-person company, of course, I did not.
Sure.
I guess I'm just lucky I had a degree in political science, and that kept me from saying anything that would totally get me in hot water.
Yeah.
Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you.
Right side of the room. Brandon.
My name is Wayne from Limelight Networks. I'm curious. I see ties in this to not necessarily directly, but along the same line as a concerted effort to what the first discussion of this conference was about, with regards to the NSA surveillance, and into the more historic trend of the government trying to effectively make secure cryptography illegal. It seems to me that that them being able to contend through the courts that they have authorization to get access not simply to the specific user's information that they were after, but to your information generally and your master data, which would allow them to not only monitor your existing customers but any future customers that you might have signed up. Seems to be a fairly significant push in that direction by the federal government. Do you see other ramifications, other implications that I've missed?
Yeah, well, what you're talking about is the Clipper chip debate. For those of us who are old enough to remember the 90s and the discussion about whether or not we should have these chips that could do cryptography but were weakened such that, the government would have the keys to decrypt the data. Well, we decided as a society that strong crypto, that privacy was more important in a free society than a government's need to conduct surveillance. And as a result, the government lost. Well, what we're learning is that they didn't give up. That what they've been doing since then, and certainly since 9/11, is using the courts to effectively accomplish the same goal. Only they've been doing it in secret, because if they're doing it in secret, nobody has an opportunity to object. Nobody has an opportunity to speak out against it. And that's precisely what's happening. Is they're going along and they're weakening standards, demanding companies change their products, demanding SSL keys from companies like mine so they can monitor information that goes over the wire, and they're doing it all in secret and not giving the public the opportunity to speak out against the practice.
And more importantly, we learned from the NSA that if they're told no, it doesn't matter, they do it anyway.
Yep.
Greg Dendy on the right.
Hi, Greg Dendy with Equinix. I'm curious, is this the first time Lavabit had been contacted by a law enforcement agency for content or data related to a criminal investigation?
No. I think I've probably received on an average of 2 to 4 requests a year in the 10-year history of the service, but they were always narrowly tailored to a specific address or account. I think it may have been the first time that I got a request for a pen, trap, and trace device.
In the center?
My name is Andrew Sullivan. I work for Dine. I want to pick up on something you said in response to the previous question, because I think you've highlighted something that's really important here. The previous attempts of control on cryptography were primarily technical, and the current round of attacks on cryptography, and let's not make any bones about it, this is an attack on the network, are primarily social. But there is a technical component to this that we all can do something about. So, we can do something about the social stuff too, but I don't know enough about politics to recommend what to do there. But in the technical area, we have the opportunity to make sure that we're implementing algorithms that have perfect forward security, right? So, so if, for instance, we all use Diffie-Hellman exchanges on these things, yes, we put up with a little bit of latency, and we put up with some additional overhead and so on. But on the other hand, if those keys are compromised, the only thing that's lost is that very event, and we don't lose all of the other stuff. So this is something that we ought to go back to our networks and have a look at. What are our security policies in there? What are the algorithms that we're using? Because most of us, I think, and I count myself among this, have in the past assumed that these kind of attacks, if they happen, were going to be incredibly rare. And it turns out now that they're completely ubiquitous, and so we need to reevaluate the security policies that we have.
Yeah, and that's been my message for the last week, at least when talking to a technical audience, is that, to my knowledge, there's only one company on the internet right now that even supports, on a large scale, Diffie-Hellman, and the problem is most browsers aren't configured to take advantage of it. So it needs to happen on both sides. We need to go back and we need to modify the configurations in our servers so that they offer support for Diffie-Hellman and hopefully prefer it, and people who are working on the client side need to do the same. At least in my case, I have it on pretty good authority. They probably would have done a man in the middle if I had enabled Diffie-Hellman. But there was the secondary aspect of, even if I did enable it, most of the people connecting to my system wouldn't have taken advantage of it. So it wouldn't have made much of a difference.
Last question in the middle.
So I have a very quick comment and then a question. So, Brandon Ross, Network Utility Force. We're a small company as well. We're only like 6 guys. But I wanted to reinforce what you said before about not having an attorney that you could go to, that for the other folks in this room that are also small companies like us, it's not that hard. You don't necessarily even have to have someone on retainer, but have a relationship with an attorney that you can call and when something like that goes down to help you. So if you don't have one, check around locally. Almost every city has somebody, and at least the first thing they can do is tell you to shut up, because that's what you should do.
Yeah, I actually did have several attorneys that I had relationships with in Dallas, but of course none of them were specialists in this area of law, and none of them could represent me in a courtroom in Alexandria. So I reached out to the EFF. That was my first reaction. And unfortunately, at least I suspect that they couldn't have helped me in this particular case because of what could have been a conflict of interest. I mean, you can only sue the government on so many issues at once. So I've decided that, if there is any money left over in the defense fund when it's over, is that I hope to set it up as a fund that hopefully the next small company can use. To at least provide for some legal support for a small company like yours, somebody that they can call and know that they're not going to get a bill for $10,000 just for asking a question.
Yeah. And then my actual question: does the ordeal that you went through, is there at least some little bit of silver lining here that says that that if they're using these methods to get to the data, does that mean at least as engineers we've done a good job of actually creating truly secure methods of communication and storage that they can't easily break?
It does say that to a certain extent. If you've been studying the crypto debates very closely, I think most of us believe the cryptographic primitives are secure. What they've really been going after are the implementations the periphery, the random number generators. They've been finding ways of collecting the keys, like, for example, picking them up when somebody emails them to themselves and they go over the internet, or drops it on their G Drive account or something like that, or posts it to their Facebook page. I don't know if anybody's done that, but there are a number of ways to get the keys, and I guess in my case I was lucky enough that I had enough understanding of information security not to make myself vulnerable. How much we can actually trust hardware, it's hard to say. There's a rumor going around that when Snowden arrived in Russia, the KGB tossed out all their computers and started using typewriters because they didn't trust the random number generators in their Intel chips anymore. It's hard to say. I guess, you know, I was a cheap bastard and I bought old servers off eBay with older Pentium chips and older Xeon chips, so, you know, could be that they came after me to get the keys because, you know, I'm not using any of their flawed stuff. But that's the problem, is we don't know. We don't know what we can trust. At least in this case, it seems like they needed, you know, my RSA key in order to break it. It's not to say that they might not have been able to brute force a key of 2048 bits, you know, in 3 months, but they didn't want to wait 3 months to do it.
Next.
Thank you.
Is there anybody from GoDaddy here?
Yeah, I think there are a couple guys here.
GoDaddy actually revoked the certificates that were issued associated with those private keys yesterday. Something, yeah. I was just curious if the guys from GoDaddy could find out, you know, what the backstory was on that. Let me know. Because I had been planning on doing it, but the problem with revoking the keys within the 60-day window was I was worried I would get another contempt charge. So, find me afterwards.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ladar.
I'm blushing again. Are we ready to get off?